Let's talk about one of the weirdest and most unpredictable fighters in MMA history. A guy who, in his prime, could take on the best fighters in the world and beat them. But he could just as quickly find himself on the wrong end of a career-altering knockout. I'm talking about Keith Jardine, the master of meanness. Jardine was a fighter who made absolutely no sense. His style was weird, his offense was awkward, his movement was out of the ordinary. And because of that, he was a nightmare matchup for anyone. Think about this. This guy knocked out Forrest Griffin when Griffin was just one win away from superstardom. He beat Chuck Liddell, yes, Chuck Liddell, when Chuck was still one of the most fearsome knockout artists in the UFC. But Jardine's career has been one of the weirdest roller coasters in MMA history. At one point, he looked like a title contender. The next moment, he was knocked out violently. His style was both his greatest weapon and his greatest downfall. But what happened? Let's find out. And what better way to do it than from the beginning? You see, before he knocked people out in the UFC, Keith Jardine had a completely different kind of career. He wasn't a kid who grew up wrestling since he was 5, nor was he a Golden Gloves boxer with Olympic aspirations. In fact, MMA wasn't even on his radar when he was a kid. Jardine was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at a time when the city wasn't exactly a hotspot for MMA talent. Yes, today, Albuquerque is home to one of the most legendary gyms in the world, Jackson Wink MMA. It's produced champions like John Jones, Holly Holm, Carlos Condit, and Rashad Evans. But back then, the MMA scene didn't exist yet. And that's part of what makes Jardine's story so unique. Before he set foot in the cage, Jardine worked as a wildland firefighter. In fact, fighting wildland fires already requires a great deal of toughness. Fighting wildland fires is not like working a 9-to-5 job. It's brutal, unpredictable, and physically demanding. You're carrying heavy equipment in extreme conditions and literally risking your life. To be honest, it's a lot like fighting in a cage. Even Jardine has said in interviews that his time as a firefighter helped him develop the mental toughness he'd later use in his MMA career. That same toughness made him one of the toughest fighters to break inside the cage. And that wasn't his only job at the time. When he wasn't fighting fires, he worked as a bouncer at some of the toughest bars you could imagine. All of which were tough guy jobs. If you've ever been to a bar, you know it's not just about checking IDs. It's about dealing with drunk, aggressive idiots who think they're the next UFC champion. Jardine got in quite a few street fights during this time. He wasn't a trained fighter yet, but he knew how to throw his hands. And he had real experience in violent situations. That's when he started thinking that he should make a living out of fighting. And he did. Jardine somehow found his way into Greg Jackson's gym, which wasn't as powerful as it is today. Jackson wasn't yet the legendary coach who would train John Jones. But even then, Jackson had a knack for taking unusual players and making them effective. And let me tell you, Jardine was unusual. His striking was awkward as hell, his movement was weird and unpredictable, and his defense was, well, not always great. But what Jardine had was heart, toughness, and an unpredictable striking rhythm. He drove his opponents crazy. Jackson, a great coach, saw the potential. Over time, Jardine developed a low, stiff stance, a quirky, jerky style that made it difficult for opponents to time his shots, and a devastating leg kick game. He wasn't the cleanest striker, nor was he the fastest or strongest, but it was really hard to figure out what he was. After a brief stint on the local MMA scene, Jardine got his first big break on The Ultimate Fighter Season 2. If you don't remember the early seasons of TUF, it was rough. Back then, fighters didn't just compete for contracts. They lived in houses together, drank too much, and sometimes just fought in the backyard. It was the Wild West of MMA reality TV. And this was right after the success of The Ultimate Fighter Season 1, so a lot of people were watching. So even though Jardine didn't win the tournament, he made an impression. He was tough as nails, and had a quiet, mean personality that made him stand out. That's where he got his nickname, Dean of Mean, and when the UFC saw him fight, they knew he belonged in the major leagues. Jardine made his official UFC debut in 2005, and people immediately noticed something. This guy was different. a lot of people still saw him as a stepping stone and a skilled fighter. They saw him as a great fighter who could match you. They were great fighters who deserved to be up against better fighters. But Jardine wasn't going to take that at all. In 2006, he was scheduled to fight Forrest Griffin, and that's where things got crazy. You see, up until this point, Jardine was considered a solid, but unspectacular, light heavyweight. He was dangerous, but no one thought of him as a serious title contender. This fight made him famous. Forrest Griffin was one of the most notable rising stars in the UFC at the time. After his legendary fight with Stephen Bonner, he became one of the most beloved fighters in the company. The UFC booked the Griffin vs. Jardine fight with one goal in mind: Griffin wins. Griffin looks great. Griffin gets one step closer to a title shot. Jardine was supposed to be Forrest's stepping stone, but he seems to have not gotten the memo. It was clear from the start that Jardine was not going to give in. He pressured Griffin, acted aggressively, and threw his signature looping punch that looked awkward but landed hard. Then in the second round, it happened. Jardine landed a brutal right hand, then a flurry of hellish punches. Griffin collapsed. And suddenly, the UFC's golden boy was lying unconscious on the canvas. Jardine had just shocked the world. The man who couldn't win at TUF had knocked out the winner of TUF Season 1. Forrest was going to be a future champion. He was the ultimate fan favorite, the guy everyone loved to watch fight. He had a steel jaw, an outrageous gas tank, and an aggressive fighting style that usually overwhelmed his opponents. And Jardine had just played the ultimate spoiler. He came into the cage that night as an underdog and emerged as a legitimate contender in the UFC's crowded light heavyweight division. And if you thought that was the pinnacle of his career, oh, wait a minute. Because he's about to shock the world once again when he takes on one of the most fearsome knockout artists of all time and gets the biggest win of his career. After his fight with Forrest Griffin, he became something of a wild card in the UFC's 205-pound division. No one could understand him. You could expect him to beat anyone and lose to just about anyone. The reason I say this now is because after Jardine's brutal knockout win over Forrest Griffin, he suffered an embarrassing 48-second loss in his next fight. But more on that later. So the UFC did what they always do when they don't know what to do with a fighter. They handed him over to Chuck Liddell. Now let me set the scene here. Chuck Liddell wasn't just a former champion. He was an MMA icon and a living legend. In his prime, he was scary. He had the most outrageous knockout power in UFC history. He could knock you out while moving backwards. He could knock you out without even touching you. He had one of the most devastating counter-attacking styles we've ever seen. And the UFC thought this would be the perfect comeback fight for Liddell. They thought he'd get through Jardim and get right back into the title picture. But like Forrest Griffin, Jardim was supposed to be the ultimate spoiler. From the opening bell, Jardim did something few guys have done against Liddell. He fought smart. Most guys would fight Chuck and lock. But Jardine knew you couldn't trade bombs with Liddell. It was like giving a knife to a guy with a bazooka. So instead of fighting, Jardine slashed Liddell in the legs with brutal kicks. Every time Chuck tried to intervene, Jardine would hit him in the front leg. And to everyone's surprise, it worked. By the second round, you could see the frustration on Liddell's face. Jardine kept moving, he was stuck, he didn't stand still long enough for Chuck to land a deadly right hand. He beat him, he took him down, and when the final bell rang, Keith Jardine had just beaten Chuck Liddell. And I was like, oh my gosh, okay, that's cool, yeah. Let's go, let's shake Anaheim again. Okay, you guys weren't together then, right? Yeah, we were. Were you in the fight? Yeah, no, I wasn't. When you look at the main event fight with Chuck, where were you? I was at home with my friends. That's one of my favorite pictures I've ever seen. One of my favorite pictures. I must have pictured it in my head. What was your reaction when I announced that I won? Yeah. Tell me about that. Where were you? I was on the floor. The crowd was shocked. The UFC was shocked. Like I said before, he was stiff because every time he touched me, even if I blocked, I was a little bit squealing. I started seeing some openings toward the end of the first round, and I felt I started to turn the tide a little bit. I felt like there were some little moral victories, and I saw him get a little tired. So, I was pretty confident going into the second round of that fight. And just like that, Jardine had beaten two of the biggest names in the UFC in less than a year. People were starting to ask, is Keith Jardine a legitimate title contender? And honestly, at the time, he looked like he was. But just when we thought things were looking good for Keith, things started to go downhill. Because for all his incredible upsets, Jardine's style was a double-edged sword. It was unpredictable. Yes. It confused opponents. Yes. But when fighters started to figure him out, the knockouts came fast and hard. As I mentioned earlier, after his fight with Forrest Griffin, the UFC was excited about Jardine. They thought they had another potential title contender on their hands. So they matched him up against Houston Alexander, who was relatively unknown at the time. In theory, Jardine had more experience. He was up against tougher competition. So he should win the fight easily, right? Well, we didn't have to wait long to get an answer to that question. In just 48 seconds, Jardine was knocked unconscious. Houston Alexander knocked him out. From the opening bell, Alexander charged forward like a fucking bulldozer. He grabbed Jardine with a flurry of punches, pushed him against the cage, and unleashed pure violence. It was as brutal and sudden as a knockout can be. To understand this in today's MMA context, imagine a fighter today knocking out Israel Adesanya and then losing to an unranked opponent. That's how shocking a loss would be for Jardine. And just like that, with one knockout, the hype train derailed. Yes, he would beat Liddell in his next fight, but the hype that he would be a real contender was over, and he began to be labeled as a lucky fighter at times. And what really solidified that reputation for him was his fight with Wanderlei Silva, right after his win over Chuck Liddell. Silva was another legendary knockout artist, and it was clear from the first few seconds that this was going to be ugly. Silva came forward like a rabid animal, throwing right-handed bombs, and immediately knocked him down. He ran at him, unleashing brutal ground and pound, knocking him unconscious in just 36 seconds. At this point, things were spiraling out of control. He won one fight and got knocked out in the next. He had a big win over Griffin, and was completely knocked out by Houston Alexander in 48 seconds. He found a way to beat Chuck Liddell, but then went into the shadows thanks to Wanderlei Silva. If social media had been as big as it is now, X would have bombed every time this guy stepped into the octagon. People started questioning his chin, and when that happens in MMA, it's hard to turn back. Take Tony Ferguson. And like Tony, Jardine went on a 4-fight losing streak, losing to Rampage Jackson, Thiago Silva, Ryan Bader, and Matt Hamilton, and was out of the UFC altogether in 2010. And so ended one of the UFC's most unpredictable careers. Yes, he fought 6 more times after that, but rarely won, and his career was never the same. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Rather than being forgotten, he completely reinvented himself. Jardine had a rugged look, real-life fighting experience, and a reputation as a tough guy. And guess what? Hollywood loves guys like that. I know a lot of fighters dabble in acting. Maybe they'll get a few roles playing a subordinate in a low-budget action movie, mumble a few lines, and call it a day. But Jardine actually made it in the business. He wasn't just a former fighter thrown into a random scene for the sake of authenticity. He worked for himself. His first turning point came in stunt work. He worked as a stuntman in Hollywood fight scenes. And who better to do a fight scene than someone who actually made a living fighting? But here's the thing, Jardine didn't just focus on stunt work. He started out as a real actor, not just a background puncher, but delivering lines and playing characters with real screen presence. And if you've watched TV or action movies in the last decade, you've probably seen him without even realizing it. He first made an impact as a menacing enforcer in Breaking Bad, then went up against Keanu Reeves in John Wick, then fought Hugh Jackman in Logan, and then played one of Donald Pierce's cybernetic Reavers. That's not all. He's also starred in Inherent Vice with Joaquin Phoenix, played a ruthless mercenary in Netflix as The Punisher, and appeared in Better Call Saul. That's a pretty impressive resume, in my opinion. Keith Jardine has starred in movies like Logan, Running with the Devil with Nicolas Cage, and many others. That's all we're going to talk about here. You're here with your wife Jodie Escabel, who's fighting Hannah Cyphers this weekend. We have to talk about Hollywood. What was it like being in that movie and getting killed by John Wick in John Wick 1? John Wick 1 was great. In fact, I had a bigger scene with him. We were running out of time. We had to do a really elaborate fight, and I just got shot in the head. Jardine may not have been a UFC champion. He may not have had the longest winning streak. But what he had was one of the most unique, unpredictable, and completely entertaining careers in MMA history. He knocked out legends and got knocked out himself. And when the fight was over, he had a whole new career in Hollywood. To be honest, that's a huge legacy. So the answer to what happened to Keith Jardine is, he shocked the world. He got knocked out, he reinvented himself, and ultimately, he left on his own terms. It's not something every fighter can do.